The rain poured relentlessly, drenching the dimly lit highway. Jake Dawson, a struggling mechanic, was on his way home when he spotted a stranded car on the roadside, a sleek black luxury sedan with a flat tire. Most people would have driven past. He almost did. But something told him to stop. Little did he know the woman standing in the rain wasn't just another stranded driver. She was a billionaire. And this simple act of kindness would change his life in ways he never imagined. Because sometimes fate rewards the right hearts. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The rain hammered against the windshield, each drop blurring Jake Dawson's vision as his old pickup rattled along the empty road. The wipers struggled to keep up, smearing the water rather than clearing it. He tightened his grip on the wheel, eyes darting between the desolate highway and the glowing red needle hovering just above empty. He had been pushing his luck for days, stretching every last drop of fuel, telling himself he'd make it to payday. Now, with the storm rolling in and the roads slick with fresh rain, he wasn't so sure. His mind was a mess of unpaid bills, overdue rent, and the gnawing worry about his little brother Danny, whose medical expenses were piling up like a weight Jake could never put down. It wasn't supposed to be this way. He was supposed to be moving forward, making something of himself. Instead, he was stuck, barely scraping by, one car repair away from losing everything. Lightning slashed across the sky, illuminating the drenched pavement ahead. That's when he saw it. Hazard lights flashing through the downpour, a sleek black car pulled over on the shoulder. Even from a distance, he could tell it didn't belong in a place like this. The polished curves, the custom rims. This was the kind of car that belonged in the city, parked in the private garage of someone who never had to worry about gas money or late notices. He should have kept driving. He had nothing to give, no time, no energy. And if he ran out of gas before reaching home, it wouldn't be this stranger's problem. But something, maybe instinct, maybe that damn part of him that never knew how to turn away, made him slow down. Through the rain, he could make out a figure, a woman, standing in the storm, her dark coat soaked through, phone pressed to her ear. She was pacing, frustration visible even in the dim glow of her taillights. She looked like someone used to control, someone who wasn't used to being stranded in the middle of nowhere. Jake exhaled sharply, cursing himself even as he eased onto the shoulder. His truck groaned in protest as he threw it into park, the engine coughing before settling into an uneasy silence. He could feel the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him, every muscle in his body screaming to just go home. But he had already made his choice. Pulling his hood over his head, he pushed open the door and stepped out into the rain. Cold water soaked through his boots instantly, the wind whipping against his face. The woman turned sharply at the sound of his door slamming shut, eyes locking onto him, cautious but not fearful. "You all right?" Jake called over the storm. She hesitated. For a moment, he thought she might brush him off, tell him roadside assistance was on the way. But then, with a sigh, she nodded toward her car. "Flat tire," she said, voice firm, but laced with something else, frustration, maybe even exhaustion. "And my damn spare's missing." Jake let out a breath, running a hand through his rain-drenched hair. Of course, it couldn't be easy. He glanced back at his truck. At the gas gauge he already knew was a lost cause. He should have just kept driving. Instead, he took a step closer. "I can help?" The rain lashed against Jake's face as he took another step closer, his boots sinking into the soaked gravel lining the road. The air was thick with the scent of wet asphalt and the low rumble of distant thunder. His jacket was already useless against the storm, the cold seeping into his bones. But it wasn't the weather that made his pulse quicken. It was the woman standing in front of him, struggling with the lug wrench, her long dress clinging to her legs, her dark hair plastered to her face. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't the type to cry for help or scream into the storm. She was composed, though Jake could see the frustration etched into the tightness of her jaw as she yanked at the wrench, her movements sharp, impatient. The rain had ruined whatever polished image she had started the night with. Her makeup streaked, her dress clinging to her like she'd walked straight out of a flood. But even drenched, even standing beside a car that had no business being on a road like this, she carried herself like she belonged anywhere she wanted to be. Jake wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe for her to wave him off, tell him she had it handled. People like her, people who drove cars like that, didn't need help from guys like him. Instead, she let out a breath, dropping the wrench with a sharp clatter onto the wet pavement. Her shoulders squared, like she had to convince herself before she turned to face him fully. For the first time, he got a good look at her, sharp, intelligent eyes that didn't flicker with fear, just mild surprise at the sight of him standing there, soaked to the skin, hands shoved into his pockets. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice rough, louder than he intended just to be heard over the storm. She hesitated. He could see the battle playing out behind those eyes. Maybe she wasn't used to accepting help. Maybe she didn't trust him. Maybe both. Then, finally, she gave a slow nod. "Yeah," she admitted, exhaling, her voice carrying over the rain, steady but reluctant. "I think I do." Jake crouched beside the car, his fingers numb as they worked the lug nuts loose. The rain poured down in relentless sheets, drenching his clothes, running down his face in rivulets, but he didn't stop. He had done this 1,000 times before, at the shop, on the side of the road, for neighbors, for strangers. The mechanics of it were simple. What wasn't simple was the way the woman stood watching him, arms crossed, silent except for the occasional shift of her heels on the slick pavement. The wind howled through the trees lining the deserted stretch of highway, carrying the distant growl of thunder. He could feel her gaze on him, studying, analyzing, as if trying to place him, figure out why a man like him had stopped. She wasn't panicked, wasn't making small talk, just watching. Most people would have at least tried to make conversation by now, maybe thrown out a polite, "Thanks, I really appreciate this." But she just stood there, composed despite the storm, despite the way the rain had turned her elegant dress into something nearly unrecognizable. He tightened the last bolt and rocked back onto his heels. "You're good to go," he said, standing and wiping his hands on his jeans. Though it didn't make much difference. He was soaked through. He gestured toward the car. "Try it. Make sure everything feels right." She nodded once, stepping past him to slide into the driver's seat. The car purred to life with an effortless hum, smooth and controlled, just like she was. He half expected her to just drive off with nothing more than a wave through the window. Instead, she turned the engine off, pushed the door open, and stepped back into the rain. Without a word, she reached into her bag, pulled out a sleek black wallet, and held out a crisp $100 bill. "For your trouble," she said. Jake barely glanced at it before shaking his head. "Don't worry about it," she frowned, brows knitting together. "I insist. You don't have to pay for good deeds." That made her pause. He could tell by the way her fingers hesitated around the bill, the way something flickered in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place. Maybe disbelief, maybe curiosity, maybe something else entirely. Most people always wanted something, always expected a trade. He had spent years watching people put price tags on kindness. But this was just a flat tire in the rain, nothing more. For the first time since he pulled over, she actually looked surprised. "No one ever says that," she murmured, almost to herself. Jake shrugged. "Guess I'm not most people." For a long moment she just stood there, staring at him like he was some kind of anomaly. Then, slowly, she tucked the bill back into her wallet. "Thank you," she said finally. And then, without another word, she got into her car and drove away, leaving Jake standing in the storm, wondering why he suddenly felt like he had just been part of something bigger than a simple act of kindness. The taillights of the luxury sedan cut through the rain, glowing red against the slick black road as the car pulled away. Jake stood motionless, his breath visible in the cold night air, watching as the vehicle disappeared into the storm. The wipers on his truck squeaked against the windshield, the rhythmic sound breaking the eerie quiet that followed. Just like that, she was gone. He let out a breath and shook his head, running a hand through his rain-soaked hair. It should have felt like any other roadside fix, a quick favor for a stranger, a job well done. But it didn't. Something about the encounter sat heavy in his chest, like the weight of an unfinished sentence. Maybe it was the way she had looked at him just before leaving, a thoughtful hesitation in her eyes, like she wanted to say something else but changed her mind. Or maybe it was how she had tucked the money away, as if stunned by the idea that not everything had to be bought. Most people he helped gave a quick thanks and moved on. She had been different. Shaking off the thought, he turned and climbed back into his truck, slamming the door against the cold. The cabin was damp, the air thick with the scent of wet leather and motor oil. He exhaled sharply, resting his hands on the steering wheel, staring at the empty road ahead. Why was he still thinking about her? It wasn't like they ran in the same circles. He was just a guy, fixing cars for a living, barely getting by. She was, well, whatever she was, she didn't belong on a dark highway, changing a tire by herself. The way she carried herself, the way she stayed composed even in the storm, told him she was used to control, power, money. And yet something about her had been real. With a tired sigh, he turned the key in the ignition. The old truck sputtered before the engine coughed to life, the gas gauge teetering dangerously close to empty. He didn't have the luxury of wondering about mysterious women in the rain. He had rent to pay, a shop to keep open, a brother to take care of. Still, as he pulled onto the road, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. This wasn't the last time he'd see her. The next morning, Jake rolled open the heavy metal door of his garage, the familiar scent of grease and gasoline filling the air. The storm had cleared overnight, leaving behind damp pavement and a crisp chill that cut through his jacket. His body ached from the hours spent in the rain, and he hadn't gotten much sleep. Not that it mattered. Sleep didn't keep the lights on. Work did. The garage was small, old, and barely holding together. The sign out front, Dawson's Auto Repair, was faded, the paint chipping away like it had given up trying to stay relevant. Inside, rusted toolboxes lined the walls, and an old coffee machine in the corner sputtered to life, filling the space with the scent of burnt caffeine. Jake took a sip anyway, wincing at the bitter taste. It wasn't great, but neither was his situation. The phone hadn't rung all morning, and the only car in the bay was the same one from yesterday, a rusted-out pickup that belonged to Mr. Conway, an old man who had been coming here for years. Jake had fixed the brakes 2 weeks ago, no charge. Conway had tried to pay, but Jake had waved him off, knowing full well the man barely had enough money to keep gas in the tank. That was the problem. He helped too much. The sound of heavy boots on pavement made him turn just as Frank, his landlord, stepped through the doorway, arms crossed, expression hard. Jake already knew what was coming. "You're 2 months behind, Dawson." Jake set down his coffee, forcing himself to stay calm. "I know. Business has been slow." Frank sighed, rubbing a hand over his bald head. "I like you, kid. I really do. But I can't keep letting you slide. If you don't have the money by next week, I gotta rent this place to someone who does." Jake clenched his jaw. There was nothing he could say that Frank hadn't heard before. "I'll get it," he said, even though he had no idea how. Frank gave him a look that said he didn't believe him, but he nodded anyway. "I hope so." As Frank walked out, Jake ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. The stress was suffocating, wrapping around his ribs like a vice. The garage was all he had, the only thing keeping him from drowning completely. Losing it wasn't an option. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw his brother's name flash across the screen. He answered, forcing a small smile into his voice. "Hey, Danny, what's up?" "Just checking in," his little brother said. There was a slight rasp to his voice, the kind that came from years of hospital visits and more medication than any teenager should have to take. "Did you eat today?" Jake huffed a quiet laugh. "That's supposed to be my question." "You sound tired," Danny said, dodging the response. Jake leaned against the counter, staring at the empty shop. "I'm fine, just slow business." There was silence on the other end before Danny finally said, "The hospital called about the bill." Jake's stomach turned. "I'll take care of it." "Jake," I said, "I'll take care of it." His tone came out sharper than he intended, and he immediately regretted it. Danny didn't deserve that. Another silence, then a quiet, "Okay." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "Sorry, man, there's a lot going on." "I know," Danny said. "I just don't want you killing yourself over this." Jake swallowed down the lump in his throat. "I'll figure it out." He had to, even if he had no idea how. Jake had just finished tightening the last bolt on an old Chevy suspension when he heard it, the unmistakable hum of an expensive engine pulling into the lot. It wasn't the sputtering cough of an old truck or the steady growl of a working man's car. This was something else, smooth, controlled, powerful. Wiping the sweat and grease from his hands onto a rag, he straightened, glancing toward the entrance. And then he saw it, the black luxury sedan. His stomach clenched before his mind even registered why. The same car he had seen stranded in the storm, now gleaming under the harsh daylight, looking completely out of place in his rundown shop. The driver's side door swung open, and there she was. But this time, there was no rain, no storm to blur the lines between them, no ruined dress or flickers of vulnerability in her eyes. She stepped out composed, sharp in control. A tailored blazer hugged her frame, dark slacks that probably cost more than his rent, heels clicking against the pavement with a confidence that made it clear this wasn't some stranded woman looking for help anymore. This was someone who got what she wanted. Jake felt his jaw tighten, wiping his hands one last time before tossing the rag onto the workbench. He didn't like this. Not because he was intimidated. He'd dealt with rich customers before, people who walked in expecting service and left without so much as a thank you. But this was different. This wasn't just some random visit. She had come for him. For a long second, neither of them spoke. The low hum of an overhead fan filled the silence, the faint sound of the radio playing some classic rock song he wasn't paying attention to. Then, finally, she stepped forward. "We need to talk," she said. Her voice was smooth, deliberate, just like it had been that night on the side of the road, but there was something new beneath it this time, an edge. Jake exhaled slowly, arms crossing over his chest. "Figured I wouldn't see you again?" She gave a small, unreadable smile. "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important." That feeling from last night, the one that told him this wasn't over, it had just been proven right. Jake leaned against the workbench, arms still crossed over his chest, watching her carefully. She didn't fidget, didn't shift uncomfortably under his gaze like most people did when they walked into his world, a place where grease stained every surface and the air smelled like gasoline and sweat. No, she stood tall, confident, as if she belonged anywhere she chose to be, like she had nothing to prove. She met his eyes. Eleanor Sinclair. The name clicked instantly. Sinclair Industries. Even a guy like him, buried in car parts and overdue bills, knew that name. It was everywhere. Headlines, business journals, tech conferences he didn't watch but sometimes heard about in passing. He let out a short breath, shaking his head. "Figures," he muttered. She raised a brow. "Figures?" Jake shrugged. "The car, the way you carry yourself, you weren't exactly screaming middle-class commuter when I found you on the side of the road." A small smirk ghosted across her lips, but it disappeared just as quickly. "And yet you stopped." Something about the way she said it made his chest tighten. She wasn't wrong. He could have driven past, ignored the flashing hazards, convinced himself it wasn't his problem, but he hadn't. He forced himself to keep his tone even. "So what's this about? Because I doubt you came all the way down here just to say thanks." Eleanor inhaled slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I don't usually meet people who do the right thing without expecting something in return. The world doesn't work that way, not at my level at least." Jake exhaled, shaking his head. "Lady, I changed a tire, that's all." Her gaze didn't waver. "Maybe, but the way you refused the money, the way you didn't ask for anything, that caught my attention." He scoffed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You looking to hire a mechanic? Because if so, I can give you the names of a few guys who—" "No," she interrupted, stepping closer. "I'm offering you something, Jake." Her tone was firm, unshakable. Jake didn't like it. Not because he was intimidated, but because things like this didn't happen to guys like him. He folded his arms again. "And what exactly are you offering?" She held his gaze. "An opportunity." Jake let out a sharp laugh. "That's real specific." A flicker of amusement crossed her face, but she ignored his sarcasm. "It's not something I can explain in one conversation. What I can tell you is that I see potential in you, and I don't make decisions lightly." He eyed her carefully, every instinct telling him there had to be a catch. Rich people didn't just walk into someone's life and offer them a way out. That wasn't how the world worked. The world made you claw for every inch, made you bleed for every scrap of dignity. People like her sat at the top and barely noticed the people drowning below. "So why him? Why me?" he finally asked. She hesitated, just for a second. And in that second, Jake saw something else in her, a flicker of something real. But just as quickly as it came, she buried it. "Because I trust my instincts," she said. "And they're telling me you're worth investing in." Jake clenched his jaw, the weight of her words pressing against the doubts already clawing at his mind. He didn't know whether to be flattered or furious. Instead, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Yeah?" he muttered. "Still doesn't make sense." Jake exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of Eleanor Sinclair's words settle over him like a blanket he didn't ask for. An opportunity, a chance, a lifeline maybe. But why him? He shook his head, running a hand through his damp hair. "Look, I appreciate whatever this is, but I'm just a mechanic. A small-town guy trying to keep his shop from falling apart. I'm not looking for handouts, and I'm definitely not looking to be someone's charity case." Eleanor's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked amused, or maybe just patient, like she had heard every excuse in the book, and already knew how this conversation would end before he even finished his sentence. "You think that's what this is?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "A handout?" Jake scoffed. "I don't know what else to call it. Some billionaire walks into my garage, tells me she sees potential in me, and offers me an opportunity without even explaining what it is? Sounds like charity to me." She stepped closer, and for the first time Jake noticed something different in her expression. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't pity, it was certainty, like she had already made up her mind about him, and there was nothing he could say to change it. "You're more than that," she said quietly. Jake clenched his jaw, looking away. He hated the way those words got under his skin, hated how a stranger could say something so simple and make it feel like a challenge. "Yeah?" he said, forcing a dry laugh. "And what makes you so sure?" Eleanor studied him for a moment, her sharp green eyes scanning his face like she was trying to peel back the layers he had built over the years. Finally, she reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek black business card. "When you're ready for something bigger," she said, holding it out to him. Jake stared at it. The rain outside had started up again, a steady patter against the roof of the garage. He could feel the pressure behind every choice he had ever made, every struggle, every failure, every time he had told himself that this was just the way life was. Slowly, he took the card. Eleanor gave him one last unreadable look before turning and walking back to her car, her heels clicking against the concrete. She didn't look back as she slid into the driver's seat and pulled out of the lot, leaving nothing behind but the distant hum of an engine and the weight of a decision Jake wasn't sure he was ready to make. He glanced down at the card in his hand, the name, the number, the possibilities it represented. For now, he shoved it deep into his pocket. But he knew it wouldn't stay there forever. Jake sat on the edge of his workbench, staring at the peeling paint on the garage walls. The place had been his second home for years, but now it looked more like a slow collapse than a workshop. Tools were scattered across the counter, some of them older than he was. A bucket in the corner caught the slow drip from the leaky roof, each drop a quiet reminder of how close he was to losing everything. The business card Eleanor had given him burned like a brand in his pocket, but he hadn't pulled it out since she left. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because looking at it felt like admitting something, admitting that, for the first time in a long time, someone saw him as more than just a guy who fixed cars and barely made rent. And that scared him more than the thought of losing the shop. He let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping restlessly against his knee. Had he made the right choice? Turning her down had felt like the right thing in the moment. What did a billionaire like her want with someone like him anyway? Opportunities like that didn't just land in his lap without a catch. But now, with the silence of the garage pressing in, the weight of reality settling back onto his shoulders, he wasn't so sure. His eyes flicked to the stack of overdue bills sitting on the counter. He hadn't even opened the latest ones. What was the point? He already knew what they'd say. Final notice, past due, urgent. The words had all started blending together at this point. Frank, his landlord, had made himself clear. One more missed payment and the garage was gone. Jake rubbed his hands over his face, trying to push away the exhaustion creeping into his bones. Maybe this was fate giving him a chance. A way out. A way forward. But he had spent his whole life fighting to stand on his own 2 feet. Accepting help, especially from someone like Eleanor, felt like admitting defeat. Still, the thought wouldn't leave him. Maybe saying no had been the real mistake. Jake was under the hood of an old Ford when his phone rang. He almost ignored it. He'd been getting too many calls lately, all of them about things he couldn't fix. Late payments, overdue notices, warnings. He figured it was another reminder that time was running out. But something in his gut told him to check. Wiping his hands on a rag, he fished the phone from his pocket and glanced at the screen. Frank. A slow, uneasy breath left his lungs. He already knew what this was. "Yeah," he answered, keeping his tone neutral, even though his heart had started pounding. Frank didn't waste time. "I gave you more chances than I should have, Jake, but I can't hold off any longer. You've got 7 days." Jake shut his eyes for a second, gripping the phone tighter. "Frank, come on." "No, kid, I like you, but I've got bills to pay too. I've got another tenant lined up and they're ready to sign. If you can't come up with the money by next week, you're out." The words cut deeper than he expected. He'd known this was coming. He'd seen it in the way Frank avoided his eyes the last time he stopped by, the way he hesitated before reminding Jake that good intentions didn't pay rent. Still, hearing it said out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. He swallowed hard. "I'll figure it out," Frank sighed. "I hope so." The call ended, leaving Jake standing in the middle of his empty garage, the silence pressing in like a noose. He had a week, 7 days before everything he'd built was gone. His hands twitched toward his pockets before his brain could catch up. He didn't need to look, he already knew what was there. The small, sleek business card he hadn't touched since Eleanor had handed it to him. His fingers found the edges of it, smooth and expensive, nothing like the life he knew. He pulled it out, stared at the embossed lettering. Eleanor Sinclair. He exhaled sharply, jaw tight. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he dialed the number. The phone barely rang once before she picked up. "I was expecting you," she said. Jake wasn't sure what he expected when Eleanor told him to meet her, but it sure as hell wasn't this. The garage wasn't a garage. It was something out of a damn movie. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows, sleek metal workstations, and a line of luxury cars that looked too expensive to even breathe near. The kind of place where engines purred like silk, not coughed like the rusted-out trucks he was used to fixing. Jake stood just inside the entrance, still soaked from the rain outside, his old boots leaving faint marks on the polished floor. He felt like an outsider from the moment he stepped through the door, and judging by the way a few of the guys in clean uniforms glanced at him before turning back to their work, they thought so too. Eleanor was already waiting for him, standing near a gleaming silver McLaren, arms crossed like she'd been there for hours. She was dressed sharply again. Pressed suit, expensive watch, that same air of effortless control she always carried. But this time there was something else in her eyes, a challenge. "Not what you're used to, is it?" she asked. Jake let out a slow breath, glancing around again. That obvious? Her lips curled slightly. "A little." She turned, gesturing toward the row of vehicles, their hoods propped open, like something out of an elite showroom. "Show me what you can do." Jake frowned. "Excuse me?" "This isn't a job offer," she said simply. "Not yet. I don't just hand out opportunities, Jake. I invest in people who can prove themselves. So, here's your shot. Pick a car, find a problem, and fix it." The air in the room shifted. Jake could feel eyes on him now, some of the other mechanics pausing their work, glancing in his direction. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders. She was testing him. Fine. He could play along. Without another word, he walked forward, scanning the cars, their gleaming surfaces reflecting the overhead lights. He stopped in front of a sleek black Aston Martin. He didn't hesitate. He popped the hood, letting muscle memory take over. If she wanted proof, he'd give it to her. Jake could feel the weight of their stares before he even reached the car, the mechanics in their pristine uniforms, arms crossed, smirking like they already had him figured out. He was the outsider, the nobody, the guy with grease-stained jeans and a truck that probably wouldn't even be allowed in this building's parking lot. One of them, a broad-shouldered guy with perfectly styled hair, let out a low chuckle. "You sure you're in the right place, pal? This ain't a body shop for busted pickups." Jake ignored him. He wasn't here to trade words. He focused on the black Aston Martin in front of him, hands moving on instinct. A quick scan under the hood told him everything he needed to know. Whoever had worked on it last had overcomplicated the wiring, treating it like some fragile masterpiece instead of a machine built to move. He had just started to work when a commotion at the far end of the garage made him glance up. A Ferrari 812, super fast, bright red and looking like it had rolled straight out of a billionaire's dream, sat dead on the shop floor. The lead mechanic, Jake, recognized him as the guy who made the first snide comment, was frowning at the engine, frustration evident in his tight jaw. Jake didn't need to hear what they were saying to know what had happened. The car wouldn't start. He could see it in the way they hovered around it, poking at wires, muttering under their breath. The so-called experts were stuck. And then Eleanor spoke. "Jake," she called, turning toward him, "go take a look." The room went silent. Jake let out a slow breath, wiping his hands on a rag as he walked toward the Ferrari. He could feel the lead mechanic's glare drilling into the side of his head. "You gotta be kidding me," the guy muttered. "This guy?" "Do you have a problem?" Eleanor asked, her voice smooth but sharp. The mechanic shut his mouth. Jake didn't wait for permission. He slid behind the wheel, turned the key, and listened. Really listened. The rhythm of the engine told him everything he needed to know. 5 minutes, that's all it took. A small adjustment to the fuel injector timing, a recalibration of the electronic throttle, and the car roared to life like it had never stalled at all. Silence. Then a slow whistle from somewhere in the garage. "Damn," someone muttered. Eleanor smiled, her expression unreadable, but pleased. "Not bad," she said. Jake just shrugged, stepping back. He had nothing to prove, but he had just proved it anyway. Jake leaned against one of the workbenches, still feeling the rush of what just happened. The faint scent of gasoline and oil mixed with the sterile, high-end gloss of the garage. The Ferrari's engine hummed steadily in the background, proof that he'd done the impossible, or at least what the rest of them thought was impossible. Eleanor watched him from a few feet away, her expression calm, but with a faint trace of satisfaction. She wasn't smiling, not exactly, but there was a certain look in her eyes. It wasn't the cold, calculating look of someone who simply hired, skilled labor. It was something else. "You impressed a lot of people today," she said finally, her voice low but certain. Jake let out a breath, running a hand through his hair. "I just fixed a car." Eleanor stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the pristine floor. "You did more than that, and you know it." He met her gaze, wary. The intensity in her expression made him uncomfortable. Not because he didn't believe he'd done something right, but because he couldn't shake the feeling that she was seeing something in him he didn't see in himself. "Let me guess," he said, trying to keep his tone light. "You've got some fancy job offer for me now." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, like she was weighing her words carefully. "I'm inviting you to work for me, yes. But this isn't just a job. I don't need another mechanic, Jake. I need someone who can think beyond the obvious, someone who sees the bigger picture." Jake frowned, shifting his weight. "I'm not some visionary. I'm not the guy you call to run a company or invent the next big thing. I fix engines. I make sure they run. That's it." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her gaze steady. "You think too small." He laughed, the sound short and humorless. "Small's the only thing I've ever known." "Then maybe it's time you learned something else." There was no arrogance in her voice, no condescension, just certainty. "Why me?" he asked quietly. Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "Because you have the skills, the drive, and the integrity. I don't come across that very often. You may not see it now, but I see it." Jake looked away, the words hitting harder than he wanted to admit. "You can walk away if you want," she said, her tone softening just a fraction. "You can keep fixing cars, struggling to get by. Or you can take this chance and see what you're really capable of." Her words hung in the air, heavy with something Jake couldn't quite name. The hum of the Ferrari's engine seemed distant now, his own pulse louder in his ears. She waited, giving him time to speak, to decide. But Jake had no answer yet. He just stood there, staring at the floor, wondering what the hell he was supposed to do now. Jake had barely settled into his new role when the first challenge came. The garage, for all its gleaming metal and pristine equipment, was filled with sharp glances and barely concealed sneers. Most of the crew didn't bother hiding their resentment. He wasn't supposed to be here. The whispers started before the first coffee break. He caught bits and pieces as he passed, words like lucky, charity case, and out of his league. It didn't take long for Tom, the lead mechanic, to make his position clear. Tom was everything Jake wasn't: polished, confident, and well-connected. His father had been an industry legend, and Tom had grown up with a wrench in one hand and a silver spoon in the other. He was the type who wore expensive watches in the garage, the kind who laughed a little too loudly when recounting his weekend trips to the racetrack. "So," Tom said, one hand resting casually on a workbench as Jake adjusted a car's suspension. "What's it like being Eleanor's pet project?" Jake didn't look up. "I'm here to work, just like you." "Work," Tom repeated with a smirk. "Sure, but let's be honest. We both know you didn't get here on merit." Jake felt the tension rise in the room. A few of the other mechanics paused their tasks, glancing over, waiting to see what would happen. "You've got something to say, just say it," Jake replied evenly, his voice low and controlled. Tom stepped closer, crossing his arms. "I'm just wondering how a small-town nobody walks in here and suddenly gets handed opportunities people like me have been working years for." Jake straightened, turning to face him fully. "Maybe it's because I'm good at what I do. You ever think of that?" Tom laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. "Yeah, sure. You got lucky once. Fixed a Ferrari in front of the boss, and now you think you belong here? Newsflash, pal, one fluke doesn't make you qualified." Jake's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept them there. The last thing he needed was to prove them right by losing his temper. "You don't know a thing about me," he said through gritted teeth. Tom leaned in, his smirk widening. "I know enough. You're not cut out for this place. And everyone here knows it. It's just a matter of time before you prove it yourself." Jake stared at him, his jaw tight. He didn't flinch, didn't back down. Inside, though, the doubt Tom's words planted started to grow. He wasn't sure if he belonged here, but if they thought he'd go quietly, they didn't know him at all. Jake stood across from Eleanor in her sleek office, the walls lined with awards and framed photographs of her standing beside the kind of cars he'd only ever seen in magazines. The space was cool and quiet, but there was a tension hanging in the air that Jake couldn't shake. She'd asked him here suddenly, right in the middle of a long shift. He still had grease under his nails, and his boots left faint smudges on the polished floor as he shifted his weight. Something about the way she'd looked at him when she called him in, calm, steady, yet oddly expectant, had been enough to keep him from saying no. Still, he was on edge. Eleanor sat behind her glass desk, her fingers steepled as she watched him, silent for a long moment. "I think it's time we stopped dancing around the issue," she said finally. Her tone was measured, but there was a weight behind her words that made Jake straighten. "You've proven you can handle the work," she continued. "More than that, you've proven you're someone who doesn't back down when things get tough. I've been looking for someone like that." Jake raised an eyebrow, folding his arms. "Someone like what? A mechanic? You already have a garage full of those." Eleanor gave a small, knowing smile. "It's not just about fixing cars, Jake. I'm looking for someone who can lead." The word made Jake's jaw tighten. "Lead? I'm not a manager, Eleanor. I'm not some big-shot executive. I'm just a small-town guy who sees the value in helping people who need it," she interrupted. Her voice softened, but her gaze stayed locked on his. "You remind me of someone I used to know." Jake frowned. "Who?" "My father," she said quietly. The admission caught him off guard. Eleanor's usual confidence seemed to shift, replaced by a subtle hint of vulnerability. "He was a mechanic, too, one of the best I'd ever seen. But more than that, he believed in giving others a chance. He taught me that a single act of kindness could change the trajectory of someone's life. I've built this company on that principle, and now I'm starting something new, an initiative to help struggling mechanics build businesses of their own, to give them the support and resources they need to succeed." She paused, leaning forward slightly. "I need someone to lead that initiative, someone who understands what it's like to start with nothing and fight for every inch of progress. That's why I tested you. I needed to know if you had what it takes." Jake shook his head slowly, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He wasn't sure if he believed her, if he believed he could live up to what she was asking. "You don't even know me," he said finally. "What makes you think I'm the right guy?" "I know enough," she said simply. "You've already proven it. Now it's up to you to decide if you're ready to take the next step." She leaned back, her expression calm again, but there was still a flicker of that vulnerability in her eyes. Jake felt the tension in his chest tighten, the doubts circling in his head. He didn't have an answer, not yet. Jake sat on the edge of his bed, the small room around him dimly lit by a single bulb. The muffled sounds of a late-night talk show played on the television in the living room. He hadn't bothered to close the door. It didn't matter. He wasn't watching, and no one else was there. The walls felt too close, like they'd been closing in on him bit by bit over the years. He rubbed his hands together, staring down at the calluses and grime that seemed permanently etched into his skin. These hands had rebuilt engines, patched leaking oil lines, and wrenched bolts loose after years of rust. They weren't the hands of a leader. They weren't the hands of someone people followed. Eleanor's offer replayed in his head, each word heavy and relentless. "You're more than a mechanic." The phrase looped endlessly, making it impossible to think straight. He wanted to believe her. God, he wanted to believe her. But every instinct he had told him to be cautious, to protect the little he'd built for himself. "Lead an initiative?" he muttered under his breath. The words tasted foreign, like something someone else should be doing, someone who had a clean, crisp suit and a polished way of speaking, someone who hadn't spent their whole life under the hood of cars that barely made it another mile. A flicker of anger flared in his chest, not at Eleanor, but at himself. Why couldn't he just say yes? Why couldn't he just believe he was good enough, take the opportunity, and figure it out as he went? That's what a confident man would do, someone who knew they belonged in a room like hers. He pressed his hands to his face, exhaling sharply. Deep down the truth gnawed at him. He was afraid, not of failing. He'd done that plenty of times. He was afraid of succeeding, of walking into a world he didn't understand, of finding out that Eleanor's faith in him was misplaced. The faded paint on the walls, the stacks of overdue bills, the worn-out couch in the living room, this was his world. It wasn't much, but it was something he understood. Taking her offer meant walking into something bigger, something unknown, and he wasn't sure if he could survive that. Jake stood stiffly at the edge of Eleanor's office, his arms crossed tight over his chest. He hadn't planned to come here tonight, but after hours of pacing in his tiny apartment and replaying her offer over and over in his mind, he'd finally grabbed his keys and driven straight here. Now that he was actually standing in front of her, though, the words felt caught in his throat. Eleanor didn't look surprised to see him. If anything, she seemed like she'd been expecting it. She leaned back against the edge of her desk, her usual calm presence softening just slightly. "I figured you'd show up," she said simply. Jake shifted his weight, trying to find the right words. "I don't get it. I don't understand why you're so interested in me. I'm not—" He hesitated, frustrated by how hard it was to say it out loud. "I'm not what you think I am." For a moment, Eleanor didn't respond. She studied him, her sharp green eyes scanning his face like she was piecing together a puzzle. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. "You're right," she said quietly. "You're not what most people would expect. Neither was I." Jake frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Eleanor crossed her arms, her gaze distant for a moment, as if she were looking at something far beyond the walls of her office. "I didn't start with all of this," she said, motioning vaguely to the polished furniture, the awards on the shelves, the faint hum of wealth that filled the room. "There was a time when I had nothing. Less than nothing." She paused, her voice softening. "My father was a mechanic. He was good at what he did, but life, it doesn't always care about skill. When he died, we lost everything. I ended up in foster care, bouncing from one home to the next. Nobody cared who I was, what I could do. To them, I was just another kid in the system." Jake stared at her, caught off guard by the shift in her tone. She wasn't talking like a CEO now. She was just human. "There was one person," she continued, her voice steady but quiet. "One person who saw something in me. He was a teacher at the local trade school. He told me I was smart, that I could do more than fix cars. He helped me get a scholarship, connected me with people who gave me my first real shot. Without him, I wouldn't be standing here. Everything I've built started because one person believed in me." Eleanor met his eyes again, her expression calm but resolute. "That's why I'm so interested in you, Jake. I had nothing once. Someone helped me. Now, I help others. I want to help you." Jake opened his mouth, then closed it again. He wasn't sure what to say. The anger, the doubt, the frustration that had been boiling inside him for days, it all felt muted now. Eleanor wasn't trying to manipulate him. She wasn't playing some game. She was offering him something real, something that had come from her own scars, her own history. I don't know if I can do what you're asking," he said finally, his voice low. Eleanor's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. "You can, and you will." Jake stood in the center of the garage, surrounded by the hum of high-tech machinery and the silent scrutiny of the other mechanics. The car sat in front of him, sleek and imposing, its hood raised like an unsolvable riddle, waiting for someone to crack it. Everyone had tried. None of them had succeeded. And now Eleanor was asking him, of all people, to do what no one else could. He could feel their stares burning into his back. Tom was leaning against a tool chest in the corner, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips, like he already knew Jake would fail. A few others had stopped what they were doing, tools in hand, ready to watch the show. "This is the car," Eleanor said, her voice even, "the one they couldn't figure out. If you can get it running, the position is yours." Jake walked around the car slowly, keeping his face calm even as his mind raced. What had they missed? This wasn't a beat-up truck with a loose belt or a faulty fuel pump. This was a machine built with precision, every piece engineered to perfection, except, apparently, for the piece that mattered most. He popped the hood and peered inside. The engine gleamed like it was brand new, but the moment he turned the key earlier, it had sputtered and died. It wasn't the kind of problem you could see at a glance. No obvious loose wires, no puddle of fluid beneath the car. It had to be something deeper. Jake reached for his tools, ignoring the whispers behind him. He felt the familiar weight of a wrench in his hand, the metallic smell of oil and steel filling his senses. Slowly, methodically, he started taking apart the engine's intake system. Minutes passed, then an hour. The garage grew quieter as the other mechanics drifted away, their curiosity waning. Only Eleanor stayed close, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Finally, Jake found it. A sensor buried deep in the system had been installed incorrectly, causing a cascade of failures. It was the kind of mistake that someone in a rush could easily miss, and once it was in place, it would throw off every diagnostic tool. He carefully reassembled the engine, checking and rechecking each connection. When he was done, he wiped his hands on a rag and stepped back. "Try it now," he said, his voice steady. Eleanor nodded, motioning for one of the others to start it. The engine turned over once, twice. Then roared to life smooth and steady, filling the garage with a low, powerful hum. For a moment, no one said a word. Then someone let out a low whistle. Tom shifted in the corner, his smirk gone, replaced by a tight line of his lips. Eleanor approached, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She stopped next to Jake, her expression calm, but he could see the glimmer of approval in her eyes. "Congratulations," she said quietly. "You passed." Jake exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing. He still didn't know if he was ready for what came next, but for now, he'd proved one thing. He belonged. Jake's shirt clung to him, soaked with sweat and streaked with grease, as he hunkered over the open hood. The once pristine engine bay was now a chaotic scene of disconnected hoses, scattered tools, and his sheer determination. His hands ached, his knuckles raw from scraping against unforgiving steel. Each twist of the wrench, each adjustment felt like a gamble, but he wasn't stopping now. He couldn't. The sleek black car sat lifeless under the bright overhead lights. Its silence felt heavy, like it was mocking his every move. This wasn't just another repair job. It was the final test, the one chance to prove he belonged here, no pressure. His mind raced through the possibilities. He'd check the obvious things first, spark plugs, fuel injectors, sensors, but the car still wouldn't turn over. It wasn't enough to fix what everyone else had tried to fix. If he was going to get it running, he needed to think differently, to find the one thing everyone else had missed. Minutes turned into hours. The garage grew quieter as the other mechanics filtered out, leaving only the low hum of the overhead fluorescents. Jake stayed hunched over, his face set in a grim line. He was too far in to give up now. Eleanor's words echoed in his head, cutting through his frustration. "You're more than just a mechanic." He found the flaw deep in the engine's heart, an overlooked connection buried beneath layers of components. It was a small misalignment, the kind of thing that wouldn't show up on diagnostics and would go unnoticed by someone looking only at the surface. He adjusted it carefully, his fingers shaking slightly as he tightened the last bolt. Jake took a step back, his breath uneven. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, leaving a smudge of grease behind. The tools lay scattered around his feet, the result of a long battle with a machine that refused to give in. But now it was ready. With one final exhale, he reached inside and turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, and then it roared to life. The sound filled the garage, smooth and powerful, as if It had never been broken. Jake's shoulders sagged, relief washing over him. He stood there for a moment, staring at the humming engine, the steady rhythm of it filling his ears. He'd done it. Jake sat on the edge of the workbench, staring down at his hands. His knuckles were still raw, grease embedded in the creases of his skin. The garage was quiet now, the only sound the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. He'd fixed the car, done the impossible. And still, his chest felt heavy. The relief of hearing that engine turn over had been fleeting, swallowed almost immediately by the weight of what it meant. Eleanor watched him from a few steps away, her arms crossed loosely, a calm, almost expectant look on her face. She didn't press him, didn't say a word. She just waited. For a long time, Jake didn't move. He'd spent his whole life scraping by, keeping his head down, focusing on one problem at a time. This was different. This was someone telling him he could do more, be more, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. Finally, he looked up at her, his voice low. "Why me?" She tilted her head slightly, the corner of her mouth curving upward. "Because you have what it takes." Jake shook his head, letting out a short, humorless laugh. "You don't even know me. I'm not some hotshot. I'm not—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. Not what? Not good enough. Not the kind of guy who should be given this kind of chance. Eleanor took a step closer. "You're exactly the kind of person I need," she said simply. "You see the value in hard work. You know what it's like to struggle, to fight for every inch. That's what makes you the right choice. And you proved it." Her words hung in the air, steady, unwavering. For the first time, Jake felt the doubt in his mind begin to falter. He inhaled slowly, the decision settling on him like the weight of an engine block. Heavy, but solid, real. "All right," he said, his voice steady now. "I'm in." Eleanor's smile widened slightly, a rare warmth breaking through her composed demeanor. "Good," she said, her tone full of promise. "This is just the beginning." The city skyline stretched endlessly, glass towers glittering against a pale morning sky. The plane's engines had barely quieted before Jake found himself whisked into a world that felt completely foreign. The airport alone was massive, its polished marble floors gleaming, the crowd a blur of suits and rolling luggage. He trailed behind the driver Eleanor had sent, his worn boots squeaking faintly against the pristine tiles. Out on the curb, a sleek black car waited. Jake hesitated, glancing down at his jacket, a scuffed leather relic he'd owned for years, and then at the driver who motioned politely for him to get in. For a second, Jake considered turning around, walking back into the terminal, and catching the first flight back to his small garage, back to something he understood. Instead, he climbed into the car. The city blurred past the windows, a rush of concrete and steel. Everywhere he looked, there were people who seemed to belong here, businessmen checking their watches, women in designer coats, crowds that moved with purpose. And then there was Jake, sitting stiffly in the back seat, feeling out of place before he'd even set foot in Eleanor's new garage. When they finally arrived, he stepped out into a scene that made his chest tighten. The building was enormous, the kind of state-of-the-art facility he'd only read about in magazines. The glass entrance reflected a row of pristine sports cars parked outside, each one shining like it had just rolled off the line. A faint buzz of activity spilled from within, mechanics in spotless uniforms moving with precision and confidence. Jake swallowed hard. He didn't belong here. He could feel it in the way people glanced at him, the way he could still smell the grease on his hands despite scrubbing them raw. As he walked through the wide, gleaming hallway, doubt pressed down on him. What if they were right? What if he was just a lucky small-town mechanic who'd gotten in over his head? Every step felt heavier than the last, every polished surface reflecting a version of himself he didn't recognize. But he kept walking, because for every voice in his head telling him he couldn't do this, there was another quieter voice that reminded him of why he'd come, of the cars he'd fixed, the challenges he'd faced, and the moment Eleanor looked him in the eye and told him he had what it took. Jake squared his shoulders. He wasn't sure how long he'd last in this world, but he was here. And he wasn't leaving yet. Jake knew the project was a big deal. Eleanor hadn't put it that way, of course. She had simply said it was his chance to step up to show what he could really do. But the looks on everyone else's faces told him this wasn't just any assignment. It was the first time he'd been put in charge of something that mattered, something the entire garage would be watching. He had spent days tearing through the specs, poring over blueprints, and mapping out every detail in his head. By the time he showed up that morning, he had a plan in place. He'd briefed the team, given them their assignments, and they were well into the first stage of the build when the whispers started. Jake glanced up from the tablet he was using to monitor the progress. A few of the other mechanics were clustered near the back of the shop, talking in low tones. The glances they threw his way weren't just skeptical, they were almost gleeful. Something was off. It didn't take long to find out why. When the second phase of the project began, the problem emerged. Critical parts were missing, not misplaced, not mislabeled. Gone. Without them, the entire timeline was blown. Jake could feel the eyes on him as he stepped away from the assembly line to check the inventory logs. He wasn't surprised to find Tom leaning casually against a tool chest nearby, an unlit cigarette between his fingers, watching the scene unfold with an infuriating smirk. "Looks like someone forgot to double-check the inventory," Tom said, his voice just loud enough for the rest of the team to hear. "Rookie mistake?" Jake ignored him, his jaw tightening as he reviewed the logs again. He knew he'd checked everything before they started. The parts had been there, he was sure of it. But now they were nowhere to be found. "Guess we're dead in the water until those parts come in," Tom added, his smirk widening. "Shame. Could have been a good first impression." Jake didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he stepped away from the console and grabbed a set of tools. If the parts he needed weren't here, he'd find another way. He had learned early on that sometimes the best solution wasn't the obvious one. While Tom and the others watched, Jake set to work improvising. He identified a compatible component from another project that was shelved, modified it on the spot, and installed it in place of the missing part. It wasn't the straightforward path, but it would work. It had to. By the time the engine roared into life and the assembly line picked up again, the shop was silent. The same people who had been whispering behind his back now watched him with something closer to respect. Even Tom looked thrown off, his smirk slipping into something more neutral before he turned away. Jake didn't say anything as he wiped his hands on a rag, but the small nod Eleanor gave him from across the room said enough. He had passed the test, this time on his own terms. Jake leaned over the workbench, surrounded by blueprints and hand-drawn schematics, his head pounding from hours of staring at tiny details. He'd never thought of himself as a program designer or anything close to it, but when Eleanor pitched the idea of creating something new, something that could help mechanics like him, he couldn't stop the gears in his head from turning. Every line on the page, every equation, every calculation came from years of fixing cars in a cramped shop where resources were scarce and help even scarcer. He knew the struggles firsthand, the long hours, the endless debt, the pressure of trying to keep the lights on while still doing right by customers who were just as broke as he was. Those experiences were burned into him, and that was what he drew from now. It started with a simple concept, a modular system that would allow small-time mechanics to access advanced tools and diagnostics without shelling out tens of thousands of dollars. Instead of relying on expensive proprietary equipment, this program would use adaptable, open-source components, something affordable, something that worked. Jake envisioned small garages being able to troubleshoot modern engines with the same level of precision as the big-name dealers. He wanted them to have a fighting chance. But the deeper he got into the design, the more he realized it wasn't just about tools, it was about knowledge. He drafted plans for an accompanying training platform, one that would teach mechanics how to use these new systems, how to work smarter without having to go into massive debt for certification programs. The platform would also connect mechanics to each other, forming a network where they could share tips, tricks, and solutions. It would make them stronger together rather than each shop struggling alone. Jake poured everything he had into the design. He pulled long nights, worked through weekends, and spent hours running calculations until the numbers finally lined up. By the time he presented the finished plan to Eleanor and her team, he was running on coffee and sheer determination. He laid it out in front of them, every page, every component detailed with care. "This is it," he said, his voice rough but steady. "This is what I wish I'd had when I was starting out." For a moment the room was quiet. Then Eleanor leaned forward, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Jake," she said, her voice calm but certain, "you've just created something that's going to change lives." And for the first time, Jake felt it, the shift, the break, the first real step forward. Jake's first thought was that there must have been some mistake. The building stood on the corner of a quiet street, its fresh coat of paint glinting in the sunlight. A wide roll-up garage door stood closed, but through the large glass window next to it, Jake could see spotless workbenches, gleaming tools, and bays big enough for even the heaviest trucks. The sign above the door was simple and clean. Dawson's Auto. His name. His shop. Eleanor's voice was calm, but there was a distinct warmth to it. "I thought it was time you had a place of your own, a real one. Not just a garage you rent month to month, always worrying if someone's going to take it away from you. This is yours. No strings, no catches. You earned it." Jake just stared, his breath catching in his throat. He couldn't even bring himself to step forward. The thought of walking through those doors, of feeling the smooth handle of a brand-new torque wrench, of seeing his name on the sign, he didn't know if he could handle it. "How?" was all he could manage. Eleanor smiled faintly, the kind of smile that said she'd been planning this for a while. "You proved you have what it takes. You didn't just fix cars, Jake. You built something, an idea, a vision, and you didn't stop when it got hard. I don't think you understand just how rare that is." Jake swallowed hard, trying to find the right words, but none of them came. He shook his head, his voice rough. "You didn't have to do this." "You're right," she said simply, "but I wanted to." He felt something deep inside him crack open, a mixture of disbelief, gratitude, and something that felt like fear. This wasn't a handout, he knew that much. But it was something bigger than anything he'd ever dared imagine. "This shop," he started, then trailed off. "I don't even know where to begin." Eleanor stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on his shoulder. "Begin by walking inside." Jake stepped through the open door of the shop, his boots echoing against the polished concrete floor. The space smelled faintly of fresh paint and clean metal, not a trace of the oil and grime he was so used to. Every corner was spotless, the tools perfectly arranged. The lifts were new, the kind he'd only seen in glossy catalogs before. There was a neat little office in the corner, its glass window looking out over the bays, and a break room that had an actual refrigerator, not just an old mini-fridge that hummed too loud and barely kept sodas cold. He turned slowly, taking it all in. This wasn't just a step up from the garage he'd rented. This was a dream he hadn't dared to have. His chest felt tight as he looked back at Eleanor. She stood near the doorway, her arms crossed loosely, watching him with an expression that was calm but kind. She seemed completely at ease, like this moment was exactly as it should be. But Jake wasn't. He wasn't sure he even deserved to be here, standing in something this perfect. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice breaking just a little. "Why are you doing this?" Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. Her answer came without hesitation, soft but steady. "Because the world needs more people like you." Jake felt his throat tighten. For a moment he couldn't look at her. He stared at the shiny steel countertops, the neatly stacked wrenches, the perfectly calibrated diagnostic equipment. Her words hit deeper than he expected. "I'm not," he started, but the words failed him. "Yes, you are," Eleanor said gently, stepping closer. "You care. You put in the work even when it feels impossible. You don't just fix cars, Jake. You make people's lives a little easier, a little better. That matters more than you realize." Jake swallowed hard. He wanted to argue, to brush it off, to say he was just doing his job, but he couldn't. Her conviction was too strong, too honest. "You didn't have to do this," he said, barely above a whisper. Eleanor gave a small, knowing smile. "Maybe not, but I wanted to." For the first time in as long as he could remember, Jake felt like he wasn't fighting uphill. He felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. Jake leaned against the open bay door, the crisp morning air mingling with the faint scent of motor oil and fresh coffee. The shop was quiet for now, but it wouldn't stay that way. The schedule was full, repairs lined up, engines to tune, parts to replace. It was the kind of busy that had once seemed out of reach, and now it was becoming the new normal. It wasn't just the shop's success that felt different, though. It was the faces inside. Darnell was over by the hydraulic lift, working on a beat-up old truck. A year ago, he'd been barely scraping by, doing side jobs in his uncle's garage that paid next to nothing. Now he was steady here, learning quickly, his confidence growing every week. In the corner, Amanda was sorting through parts, her movements swift and efficient. She'd walked in 3 weeks ago, desperate for work after losing her job at another shop. Jake had seen the determination in her eyes, the same mix of hunger and fear he used to feel every time he opened the garage door in his old place. He remembered what it felt like to be at the bottom, trying to make things work with whatever tools and knowledge you could scrape together. It wasn't just about fixing cars. It was about keeping the lights on, keeping food on the table, proving to yourself and everyone else that you had what it took. Eleanor had seen that in him, given him a chance when no one else would. Now it was his turn. Jake glanced back into the shop, the sound of wrenches clinking against steel, the faint buzz of the air compressor, the quiet hum of people working. He'd made it clear to everyone he brought on, this wasn't just a job. He was going to teach them everything he knew, help them find their footing, help them see that they could do more than just survive. For some, it meant learning new skills, taking on more responsibility, gaining the confidence to run the bays on their own. For others, it meant a second chance, a way to get back on their feet after life had knocked them down. As he turned back toward the office, Jake caught sight of the wall by his desk. Hanging there was the business card Eleanor had given him so long ago. He'd framed it as a reminder of how far he'd come and what he could do for others. He wasn't just running a shop anymore. He was building something bigger than just fixing cars. He was building a place where people like him could find a way forward. A place where someone's past didn't define their future, and that, more than anything, made him feel like he was finally doing something right. The late afternoon sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the empty stretch of road. Jake eased his truck to a stop, the sound of the engine fading into the stillness. A sedan sat up ahead, its hazard lights flashing a slow, steady rhythm. He recognized the look of it right away. The front tire was flat, the driver's side door slightly ajar, and a figure standing beside it, waving a hand to flag someone down. This scene was familiar. Too familiar. Jake climbed out of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder as he approached. The driver turned toward him, a young man, maybe early 20s, looking more frustrated than panicked. His suit jacket hung limply over his arm, his tie loose around his neck, the tie clip in his hand like he had just given up on it. "You need help?" Jake asked, already scanning the situation. The young man hesitated, glancing down at the flat tire, as if unsure whether he should admit defeat. Yeah," he said finally. "I was on my way to a meeting and—" He trailed off, looking down at his phone. "Roadside assistance said it would be over an hour, and I'm kind of in a hurry." Jake nodded, crouching down to inspect the flat. "You got a spare?" he asked. The man blinked. "I think so." In the trunk, maybe? Jake gave a faint chuckle, walking around to the back of the car. Let's take a look. It didn't take long to find the spare and the jack. The young man seemed eager to help, but it was clear he didn't know where to start. Jake showed him how to set the jack properly, how to loosen the lug nuts before lifting the car, and how to align the spare. The kid watched closely, nodding as if trying to absorb every detail. For Jake, it was second nature, his hands moving almost on autopilot, just like that rainy night months ago when he'd stopped for someone else. When the spare was finally on and secure, Jake wiped his hands on a rag and stepped back. The young man looked at him, a mixture of relief and gratitude on his face. "Man, I don't know how to thank you," he said. "I would have been stuck out here forever." Jake shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. Just help someone else next time you get the chance." The young man paused, then nodded slowly like he was considering the words carefully. "I will," he said. "I promise." As Jake watched him drive off, the sedan's taillights glowing in the fading light, he couldn't help but smile. The road stretched out ahead, empty again, but something about this moment felt full. The cycle wasn't broken, it was just beginning again. The garage was quiet, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights, and the occasional creak of the old wooden stool Jake sat on. His hands, rough from years of wrenching bolts and fixing engines, rested on the scarred surface of the workbench in front of him. A single photo lay there, a shot of the shop on the day it opened, bright and shiny, with Eleanor standing beside him, her hand on his shoulder. That day had changed everything. It wasn't just about the new tools, the fresh paint, or even the promise of stability. It was about the opportunity. Someone had seen something in him that he hadn't seen in himself. It had pushed him to work harder, think bigger, and believe, maybe for the first time, that he was capable of more. Jake picked up the photo, his thumb brushing against the edge of the frame. He could still hear Eleanor's voice in his head. "You're more than just a mechanic. You've got what it takes." He hadn't believed her at first, not fully. It was easier to stay in his comfort zone, fixing what was broken, making do with what he had. But she had been relentless in her faith, always pushing him to see the bigger picture. Now, looking around the shop, his shop, he understood what she meant. The faces of the people he'd hired, the steady stream of cars rolling in and out, the occasional thank you note left on the counter. Those were the proof. Proof that one act of kindness, one moment of someone choosing to help instead of walking away, could create a ripple effect that reached further than he had ever thought possible. He set the photo back down and leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. A small smile touched his lips as he turned toward the open bay door, sunlight spilling in and casting long shadows on the concrete floor. "Funny," he murmured, his voice quiet in the empty shop. "All that started with a flat tire." The lesson was simple, but the impact was anything but. A single act of kindness can change a life, or even the world. What do you think? Would you have accepted Eleanor's offer? Comment below.